the loss of that generation in some instances. But as you can see, we're seeking 750 gigawatt hours of energy on Oahu, as well as an additional 350 megawatts of grid forming resources. And that grid forming resources can come from standalone storage or from a variable renewable energy source paired with storage. It can come from new facilities, but it can also come from existing facilities that are not yet grid forming that want to convert to grid forming. And we're also seeking 81 megawatts of firm capacity on Oahu. And then on Hawaii Island, we're seeking 435 gigawatt hours of energy. And we are currently right now looking at whether we want to add a stability requirement, a grid forming requirement for Hawaii Island. And if we do, we'll reflect that in the next draft. And then we also have, we're seeking 60 megawatts of firm capacity on Hawaii Island. At this time in round one of the RFP process, we're not anticipating having any targets for Maui, though I do want to note that if we were to lose projects on Maui from the stage 3 process, we may need to change that. But at this time, we don't think that will be necessary. But we are envisioning this to be a rolling RFP process. So we envision that we will seek this amount in stage round 1, and then we'll have succeeding rounds where we seek additional generation until we meet the initial grid needs that were identified in the integrated grid plan for the near-term future. So that will go on. So as I mentioned, we made a lot of changes to the RFP before we filed the draft with the commission in August. And those changes were based on numerous amounts of feedback. So we took a lot of feedback from the energy equity docket. The commission there held 5 meetings from October of 2023 through February of 2024 to seek input from the community and others on the RFP process and ways to address concerns raised out of the energy equity docket in the RFP process. We have taken changes suggested by the Act 201 report, which was done by an independent engineer hired by the commission to look at and find deficiencies in the interconnection process and suggest improvements to that process. And then we've had many company public meetings and we've held requests for comments. And for the first time ever in the stage 3 process, we actually issued a draft of the RFP prior to filing it with the commission to seek feedback from various stakeholders on that draft prior to actually filing the draft with the commission. We also have imported lessons learned from the increased wildfire risk that we're seeing on the islands as well into this draft of the RFP. So with that, we can jump right into the changes. So the first set of changes I mentioned are based on the energy equity docket meetings and the commission staff report. And I won't have time to go into all of the changes that came out of that. I think that was a really productive set of 5 meetings. We've really learned a lot from the various stakeholders that participated. And I think we endeavored to incorporate the majority of the comments from the staff report into the RFP. A lot of those had to do with updates to the non-price criterion scoring. And what we heard from the community and what we feel too at Hawaiian Electric is that the non-price criteria really are super important to the success of a project. They're super important to how developers are working with the community to integrate the project into the community. And so we wanted to give those non-price criteria more weight and more impact in the evaluation process. And we've done that in several ways. One way is we reduce the number of non-price criteria. This gives more weight to the existing non-price criteria. Another thing that we did is in stage 3, for the first time, we had created the concept of having a community benefits package. In stage 3, that was evaluated as part of the overall community engagement non-price criteria, but in the IGP RFP, we broke those out into 2 separate criteria, as well as made the community engagement weighting on a 1 to 10 basis instead of a 1 to 5 basis. So now there's 2 criteria in community engagement that are being scored at higher weighting. We also changed some of the double weighted criteria on how those are scored. And then we moved some items to threshold requirements instead of non-price. And then finally, we have proposed to change the weighting of the price non-price evaluation. So in the initial evaluation, we're looking at a price and a non-price, and there's a combined score. In all of our past RFPs, price has been weighted 60% of that combined score, and non-price factors have only weighted 40%. And that initial evaluation is what determines what moves on to the next round of procurement. So for past procurements, prices really played a larger role in that determination of what moved on into the detailed evaluation. But for this IGP RFP, we propose to make that a 50-50 split. So as you can see, we're really trying to give more weight to the non-price criteria. The other thing that we did is we accelerated community engagement. So we really heard from the community and other stakeholders that the community wants to hear from us earlier when there's still time to have a say in how the process plays out and what it looks like. And so, as I mentioned, we released a draft of the IGP RFP prior to filing it with the commission and held a community meeting, sought feedback on that draft, and made changes further from that engagement. Also, just the grid needs for the first time ever went through an extensive community engagement process and stakeholder engagement process through the integrated grid planning docket. And really, there was a lot of feedback that went into that final integrated grid planning report, which resulted in the grid needs. And then just the last thing we really strived and we heard is when there was a one for increased transparency around the evaluation process. We've never released the scoring metrics before for the non-price criteria of what gets what constitutes something being rated a 5 versus something being rated a 1. And the reason we never released those in the past is it can result potentially in gaming by potential proposers into the RFP. However, we also recognize that it can also be helpful, and also it'll really help the community understand what we find important in a project. So we have agreed to release our scoring rubric so that the community and other stakeholders can see how we are, what we deem to be like a 1 versus a 5 when evaluating the non-price criteria. So then moving on to changes we made to the Act 201 report. The Act 201 report really focused on the interconnection process. One of the major changes that came out of that was pre-bid developer meetings. And the concept of this is in the past for interconnection, for all the questions during the proposal development period, developers could email Hawaiian Electric and we'll copy the IO and the independent observer and independent engineer and we'll respond back. That's a really complicated and hard way to have very technical conversations. Things can be lost in translation. There might, it requires a lot of back and forth to really understand what the question is. Numerous emails, really time consuming, and not the best way to transmit information or to really understand what the question is even being asked. And so the concept of the pre-bid developer meetings, developers will be required to fill out a request to meet with us, and they can submit up to 3 projects with 3 variations each. So basically 9 variations that we would be looking at to meet per island. And we would evaluate that information and then sit down with the developers and have a conversation about interconnection needs and what the interconnection might look like. And then post that meeting, we'll issue a report in writing. And those meetings will include the independent observer and the independent engineer. And really the intent of these meetings is to give more detailed information on interconnection up front to the developers so they can better cost out the interconnection costs for their projects prior to submitting their bids. Other interconnection process improvements, there's been a lot, but we also have really improved the guide that we create to help developers when they need to create their models for our interconnection requirement studies. So we've made improvements to that guide and added more detail into that guide. We're also looking to try to standardize interconnection more, so it's more clear upfront that these are the standard pieces of equipment that are going to be needed, and it's easier for developers to cost that in and understand what the interconnection is going to look like. So then moving on, just some other changes we wanted to highlight. I already talked about the concept of the rolling procurement, but that was really intended to try to streamline the procurements and allow for the procurements to occur more quickly and while we're seeking out the initial set of grid needs from the integrated grid plan. So in this concept, we wouldn't have to go back in at every time we want to reissue the RFP and seek commission approval of the RFP. As long as we're not making major changes to this draft that will eventually get approved through this process, that will be the form we use, and really just updating the grid needs that are being sought in each round. And then we also made changes to address structural and wildfire resilience requirements. So we've added, for example, requirements for developers to save space in their facilities, to allow the company to install monitoring or weather stations if we determine that's needed in the future at that location. We've also added language to the IGP, the contracts that are attached to the IGP RFP that require the developers to consult with the jurisdictional fire agencies in the area that they're building their project during the design phase and implementation, and then they're, based on that feedback, to implement what these fire agencies are suggesting to reduce the risk of any wildfire being caused by the facility. So that takes us through a lot of the changes. And again, we don't have time today in 30 minutes to go over every single change. As I mentioned, we really made a big effort to make huge strides and take a lot of feedback for the IGP RFP and update it. That's sort of the major changes we made prior to filing. And then since then, the commission has sought its own comments from various stakeholders, and we've gone through all those comments. And I just want to say we really appreciate everyone taking the time to read the materials, to really dive into them, to come up with thoughtful comments. And we worked through all of those. And so based on those comments, we are suggesting some further changes to make in the RFP based that we plan on filing next. So one area identified by stakeholders has to do with Hawaiian Electric's credit rating. And currently, we are not an investment grade. We do not have an investment grade credit rating. And we've heard from developers that that really impacts their ability to finance projects and to finance them at reasonable, market rates. And that without a solution for this issue, it could lead to more expensive financing, which could raise cost of these projects and therefore cost to customers, or it could result in projects just not being able to move forward. And while we think in Hawaii we're uniquely situated and there's mechanisms in place to address this concern and this risk, we do realize that we need to take further steps to ensure that this does not become a hindrance to moving projects forward. So obviously we're working very hard to improve our credit rating. In the meantime, we've also been working on legislation for the 2025 session that would essentially allow the state to step into the shoes of Hawaiian Electric in the event we were ever to default on payment under a PPA. Now, again, we have no intention of ever doing that. We are, making payments today just fine. We're in a situation moving forward where we will be able to make payments. But again, this is a concern that was raised, and so we do need to address it, even if we don't intend to ever default on payment. But if we were to default, the state would essentially be able to step in, collect the customer revenues that we collect now to pay the independent power producers, and then the state would turn around and use those funds to pay the independent power producers. We believe this will allow developers to finance their projects at more market rates. And so the other change we've made, in addition to working through this legislation and hoping to get this into the 2025 legislative session, is we are proposing to move the RFP schedule out. So that proposals will be due after the legislative session is complete, so that developers can take into account any legislation that may pass during the session before they need to submit their proposals for the IGP RFP. Another area where developers and others have raised comments in the docket is for having the commission clarify upfront what projects require a greenhouse gas analysis. And based on recent change in law, not necessarily every project is required to submit a full life cycle greenhouse gas analysis. So the company is open to the commission providing that guidance in advance, and we would follow that guidance and incorporate it into the RFP if it is provided, so that developers understand in advance of submitting a proposal whether or not this is a cost they should incorporate into their bid. So those are two changes we're working on, plan to make. We also identified a few changes that we could potentially make, but we wanted to make sure that everyone understands the trade-offs to those changes. So as I mentioned before, one of the major changes we incorporated was to have pre-bid meetings where developers can actually meet with us and verbally discuss their interconnection prior to submitting their bids. We do have a limit of basically 9 variations that can be submitted per island per developer. And the reason for that limitation is really just a time and resource constraint. For example, if we had 10 developers bid on each island and each one submitted 9 variations, and that's 90 projects for 2 islands, we're looking at 180 variations that the company would have to work through in a very short window of time to have the meeting, evaluate the material that's submitted by developers, then have the meeting, then create the written reports to send out after and make sure that those are getting to the developers in time that they can actually incorporate it into their proposal. So based on those time constraints, we set the initial limit, but we are open to allowing developers to have additional meetings if after that first initial cutoff to sign up for those meetings, we think that not that many projects signed up or there's not as many variations as we expected, and we think we can take on more than on a first come first serve basis, we could potentially allow that. Also, the way we have set it up is we wanted to limit the changes to projects after these pre-bid meetings. And the reason for that is we're going to give information based on the pre-bid meeting on interconnection. If developers come in and completely change the project after the fact, then the information that we're providing is no longer going to be relevant or applicable because the project has changed, and so the advice we provided wouldn't be relevant necessarily to the changed project. However, we are proposing that developers can make changes post those meetings as long as they seek company approval prior to that and understand that the limitations of the advice we provided may not apply once they make changes to the project. There was also comments that the RFP in previous rounds had a requirement for financial plan that was a non-price evaluation, and we moved that to the threshold. And there was comments and concerns about that threshold and how that threshold was being measured. We're still evaluating this. We did consider the feedback, and I do want to clarify, I think some of the feedback read the requirement as a developer bidding in having to have investment grade credit rating. That is not the fact. What is required as written is that the financing parties are working with the investment grade. However, we are taking that feedback to heart. We're still evaluating what appropriate requirements may be modified. We do think it's essential to still have evidence of a financial plan for any bidder to be able to show how they plan to finance the project, because if they can't evidence how they plan to finance the project, then the likelihood of success would be very low. But we are taking into account the feedback received and plan to see if we can make some adjustments to that language in the next round. Don't have it quite ready to share yet today. And then the last sort of area where we could make possible changes. So we had proposed in the IGP RFP that the timing of payments from the company to developers be delayed 3 additional weeks. And developers have raised concerns that this has a high financial impact on their projects, which we understand. The reason we had proposed this change, however, is right now all of our PPAs, for the majority of them, require payment to be made by the 20th business day of the month or the last day, whichever business day of the month, whichever is later. And there's a bunch of timelines prior to that date for processing data, getting that data from the IPPs, doing data analytics in order to make these payments. And what we're finding is it's already a very tight time squeeze. But now as we're adding more and more PPAs, over 40 large scale utility projects over the 3 islands, and we're going to be adding more from Stage 3 and from IGP, that requires a lot of labor resource at Hawaiian Electric to make sure that's done correctly, because everybody has the same timeline. So we're trying to spread that timeline out to avoid the need to hire additional staff just to do invoicing. If we can spread it out and the staff doesn't have to meet every invoice on the exact same days, then it would be cheaper for our customers in the long run because it reduces the overhead cost. We did think about moving that date in to stagger, but as I noted, there's a lot of data analytics and things that have to occur in order to process the invoices, and we're already running up on a time crunch for that. So moving it in to stagger really wasn't an option. So we could go back to just having everybody have payments on the same day, but we just wanted to make sure the trade-off of that could potentially result in higher administrative overhead costs to Hawaiian Electric's customers with that change. So moving on, there was also several comments from the docket, which again, we greatly appreciate, and we gave a lot of thought to whether or not to incorporate changes into the RFP. But at this time, we're proposing not to make changes to the draft we filed based on these comments. So the first one, there was a lot of comments related around aggregation of projects and allowing smaller DER projects to aggregate and bid in as a larger facility to meet the size requirements of the RFP. We strongly believe there's room on the grid for both DER resources and utility scale resources, and we want both of those, and we're going to need both of those in large quantities to meet our renewable energy goals as a state. But we don't think that this current procurement is appropriate for that. It's really structured for large projects. The grid services that are being required, the timelines that need to be met, are all geared towards large projects. I do want to note that in the past, the company has run separate procurements for aggregated DER projects using its grid services purchase agreement, or GSPA. And we have numerous DER programs currently available as well. And I think in regards to timing of looking at aggregation and procurements for that, we do know that the commission currently has open docket number 2019-0323. And based on feedback from that docket, then we can consider next steps to be taken for solar programs and grid service programs from a DER perspective. But we really think that that is the more appropriate avenue to address this particular request, which is, again, very different from utility scale projects. We also had some feedback from stakeholders that, as I mentioned, we now are requiring for the first time ever for developers to hold a community meeting prior to selection. So post submitting their proposal, but prior to being selected. And this came out of the energy equity docket as something that the communities really stressed they wanted. They wanted to have a say in the project before it's selected, before they feel it's too late to weigh in on whether or not they like the project, the location, what they want to see from the developers in the development of that project. And so we did add this requirement to have a community meeting within 30 days of submitting the proposal to Hawaiian Electric. There was concerns and comments that this might confuse communities, that they may not understand why a developer is coming to them to talk about a project and that later is never built because it's not selected. And also concerns about sharing information too early in the process. So, I think with regards to the first concern, this is something the community is specifically requesting. So I don't think there's a risk of them being confused, because this is something that they're asking for, this opportunity for earlier engagement before projects are selected. And with regards to sharing information early, we purposely set this meeting after the proposals are due so that there's no risk of developers taking information from one another prior to submitting their proposals and using that in their own proposals. And also, we believe that these meetings can happen without sharing too much confidential information, but still giving enough information about the project for the communities to have input and say and give their feedback at an early stage. Also, in the IGP RFP, for the first time ever, we're requiring early engineering developers to participate in that process. In previous rounds of our RFPs, early engineering was not a requirement, but was optional for developers. It does require developers to make payments a little bit earlier with regards to that process and starting the engineering design phase for the interconnection work. But what we found is it really eliminates the risk of surprises later, and it accelerates the schedules in order to complete interconnection. For developers that have participated in that, we found that they tend to be more successful in their projects to move through the process, again, with less surprises and at an accelerated pace. So some proposers suggested that they should be able to adjust their pricing if they do participate in early engineering. Again, we don't think that that's necessary. The intent of early engineering is to eliminate those risks. And we're also, as I mentioned, making numerous changes to the interconnection process to help developers provide more accurate pricing upfront for their projects. And then finally, there was comments from stakeholders that either developers should be allowed to get reimbursed for payments under the for interconnection payments separately from their PPA payments, and or for the company, for Hawaiian Electric, to pay for the cost of the company-owned interconnection facilities. We don't think at this time it's appropriate to make changes to that process, especially it's not the proper time to turn those payments over to Hawaiian Electric, but we do believe that some of the other changes that we've made, having the pre-bid developer meetings, trying to standardize the interconnection equipment, working through the modeling of the and providing more information on modeling of the facilities, will help to lower costs to the proposers and help them to make more accurate cost for their bids for the company-owned interconnection facilities. So we do think there are changes made that will address some of the concerns that were trying to be addressed by this requested change. So that really covers our thoughts on changes we've already made and then some of the comments that we received more recently. The last thing I just want to end with is an update to the proposed schedule from what we filed. So, our original intent was to move things a little bit more quickly, but that will be pushed out for a few reasons. One, obviously, we'll wait for further commission feedback after today, and we will be filing some responses to the commission IRs later this week. Based on that, we'll make updates to the RFP. As I mentioned, we also plan to delay the proposal due date to after the legislative session. So that's really pushing out the issuance of the RFP and then when proposals are due, which pushes out the back end. We've also provided a little bit of extra time during the evaluation period to really allow our subject matter experts to do a deeper dive into the non-price criteria in the evaluation, as well as during the detailed evaluation. So right now we're proposing a February 2025 issue date. Again, that will be dependent on how this docket progresses, and then selection by March of 2026. So I think with that, I think we're right at the 30-minute mark, and we will pause there, I think, and then when it's time for questions, we'll be happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
Thank you, Becca, and thank you for being so precise on time. Next, we're going to have a presentation from the Hawaii State Energy Office, and I believe Mark Glick will be delivering that. So Mark, as soon as you're ready, please come off mute, introduce yourself, and we can get your slides up on the screen.
Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate that, and I thank the Commission for giving the Hawaii State Energy Office an opportunity to comment. I'm Mark Glick, Chief Energy Officer. Also with us today is Monique Schaefer, our decarbonization manager, and also who heads up our special projects team. Stephen Walls, I believe, is on the call today. I think Monique is putting the slide deck up. So I'll briefly go into the summary of what we're going to talk about today on slide 2, the procurement process and some additional. If you move to slide 2, the additional considerations we have about the procurement process and some potential solutions, docket participation, after that intervention and transparency. Like to discuss a few suggestions on non-price criteria considerations, particularly around greenhouse gas evaluation. And after this hearing, we'll provide public comments and submit these comments to the docket after the meeting. On the next slide, the Hawaii State Energy Office believes that under the current Integrated Grid Plan bidding framework, the Public Utilities Commission and other statutorily mandated agencies, such as the Consumer Advocate and the Energy Office for that matter, we have limited visibility, oversight, and agency. Well, oversight primarily from the Public Utilities Commission, an agency during the period that selected projects by Hawaiian Electric are announced to the time that the contracts are executed. So the current process, as we see it, doesn't permit PUC oversight until the contract negotiation is completed and all the projects have been bundled and the aggregate grid impacts are assessed. The primary concern we have with over the process as it stands is that once the projects are aggregated, the Public Utilities Commission is placed in a difficult position if it has any concerns about an individual project when it's looking over all of the power purchase agreements that it's reviewing, and of course when projects fall out of the selection portfolio for any reason at any point in the process. If a project is terminated, replacing that lost capacity post-selection would delay integration of renewable energy. And typically until the next RFP is issued, currently at 14-month cadence, although we saw the next RFP is being planned to go out in February. We appreciate that. Any delays in the development of generation resources put the grid at risk, from a resource adequacy perspective, really from a reserve adequacy perspective as well, and it compromises achieving near-term and long-term energy goals. We also note that the Public Utilities Commission has prohibited additional intervention in this docket, which raises some further concerns about transparency. On the next slide, the Energy Office has a few suggested improvements to the procurement process that we provide for consideration. One thing that can be done out of these four broad groups are to adjust the competitive bidding framework to allow review by the Commission and the consumer advocate at a minimum, as well as potentially qualifying interveners and or participants after the eligibility and threshold stage of initial project selection. Another thing is to allow the intervention and or participation of appropriate agencies and parties, giving those parties visibility to the selection process throughout as appropriate. And we do understand that the intervention participation in this docket should be very carefully considered by the Commission and only granted to parties with strong justification. So we're not advising any change on that criteria. The third issue is to conduct procurement on a truly rolling basis or at a faster pace versus batch selection. Now we know that would provide additional duties or additional work for Hawaiian Electric, but while the IGP RFP states that the RFP is the first in a series of rolling procurements, it's not really a true rolling concept, as the project selection really occurs in batches. We would suggest the 6-month cadence instead of the current 14-month cadence, at least for a while, for new RFPs under the framework. And that has often delayed projects from submitting despite the readiness of those projects. So, if a developer gets projects ready, it's much better to get that reviewed, evaluated, and move forward if it's appropriate. And finally, consider and continue to investigate reverse auction where appropriate. That's consistent with comments that we've seen by the consumer advocate in the IGP docket 2018-0165, PUC decision order 406-51, page 10. And the fundamental findings are that reverse auctions can result in options that drive down prices. So it should be continue to be investigated. Now, finally, I'd like to just go over some on the final discussion about non-price criteria. We have a number of suggestions, and I'll go over them briefly. Additional greenhouse gas non-price criteria are needed. We agree with the importance of non-price criteria, as Becca had discussed in her presentation. And some additions could be quite useful in addressing the lack of a quantitative framework for addressing life cycle greenhouse gas emissions and the verification of those emission estimates in each submission in support of the Public Utilities Commission statutory duty to consider it. Some of the potential solutions and suggestions would be to establish a life cycle carbon intensity threshold, a CI, for combustion projects based on the fuel the project commits to burning for the life of the contract. Another suggestion is to evaluate life cycle emissions as early as the project selection, as early in the project selection process as possible. And that can eliminate projects that don't meet the greenhouse gas criteria threshold from being selected. Verification for cited CI scores shouldn't rely on EPA certifications for verification. While the IGP does list EPA verification as suitable, it may not be appropriate if federal standards do not align with state standards and goals. Therefore, an in-state verification of CI should occur on the front end. Now, to help achieve that, developing a framework for different field types to follow when developing their CI score. While the GREET default emissions factors may not be appropriate as is, the GREET model does provide a standard methodology and may serve as a good starting point. So GREET can play an important role here. And the GREET Excel spreadsheet model can be modified to generate this framework. Another suggestion is that power plant efficiency is an important component of life cycle analysis for firm generation. While heat rates may fluctuate, an average expected heat rate or expected power plant efficiency should be integrated into the analysis. Using GREET as the harmonization tool could very well address this issue. I would also like to point out that greenhouse gas evaluation on the scoring sheet, it's only worth 5 points. The Energy Office suggests weighting this more heavily, equal at least to community benefits at 10 points, especially if there's no CI threshold. You can refer to the IGP RFP Exhibit 4 non-price evaluation scoring rubric to see how it looks now. So those are our suggested changes in some of our issues that we've pointed out in the procurement process, and certainly be happy to answer any questions that anyone might have. And Monique and Stephen are welcome to join in on any response.
Thank you, Mark. And again, thank you for keeping us well on schedule. So now we've got plenty of time in the agenda for questions for our presenters. And I've said this in the chat, but I'll say it out loud. We expect the slides will be filed in this docket later this week. So Hawaiian Electric and the Energy Office, if you could please do that, that would be great. So everyone will have a chance to look at them afterwards. But I'd like to now open up questions first. If we have any commissioners here with us, I think we do. I'd be happy to offer you the first shot at questions for either of our presenters. And next will be commission staff. So any commissioners, feel free to come off mute and introduce yourself. And if not, that's okay. Maybe next then, and we'll come back to you if you've missed your chance, but next I'll ask commission staff if you have any questions for our presenters. Please feel free to come off mute, introduce yourself, and ask your questions. Abby, please go ahead.
Awesome. Hi there. I have a question for Eco. Sorry, I'm regarding the point scoring rubrics for the non-price evaluation. My understanding is that now it's 50-50, 500 maximum points for non-price, 500 for price. But the additional criteria for deductions and additions, it looks like projects can also earn 80 bonus points for co-creation and up to 40 for project siting. So I wanted to confirm a project could potentially earn a total of 620 points for the non-price criteria.
So the additional new criteria, the co-creation and the project siting criteria, as well as past performance, those you can earn or lose additional points based on those criteria. But I believe, and Greg can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's based on the total price, non-price score.
Yes, that's correct. It's based on, it gets added to the total score at the end, but it'll be above the 1,000 theoretical points.
Yeah.
Other questions from the commission? Abby, you still have your hand up. Did you have a follow-up? If yes, go ahead. Go ahead. Maybe I was wrong about that. Let's go to Taesun and then we can come back to you, Abby. Taesun is next and then Max.
Yeah, I had actually two questions for the State Energy Office. The first one was, can you expand a little bit on your comment about the current envisioned rolling blackouts kind of being still truly a batch? I mean, are you envisioning like one project selected at a time?
I mean, that would be possible. You know, batch means, you know, you have multiple projects. If indeed a well-designed, viable project is ready to go, you know, there's site control is present and, you know, it has a significant impact in terms of, you know, resources, you know, that individual project could be heard.
So do you consider the need for grouping projects or the benefits of grouping projects together and doing the evaluation together?
Well, clearly, I mean, if there are other, if that falls in the middle of a cycle, I mean, we're still talking about having cycles. I guess all we're saying is that if indeed only one project is ready, that it ought to be heard and evaluated on that basis. You know, obviously, its impact on the grid could be estimated, and then you know it could potentially move forward. Obviously, if it occurs when there's other projects under consideration, then yeah, you would put all those together and estimate grid impacts.
Okay, thanks. Second question was the comment about not necessarily using the EPA's carbon intensity. So do you have some other carbon intensities in mind, or are you developing some new intensities, and what are they based on?
Yeah. So, and I don't know, the overall effort, you know, is informed a lot by some work that we've undertaken, which we still haven't yet made public. We plan on doing towards the end of the year. But Monique might be able to share a little bit more about how we're kind of creating this hybrid approach of carbon intensity and trying to apply that from a variety of different credible resources that's publicly available. Monique, you able to comment on that?
Yeah, and I think, just to clarify, it's really relying heavily on the EPA verification. That was what I read in the docket. It's like you'll accept the verification without necessarily conducting the analysis. And I recognize life cycle analysis can be a bit of a heavy undertaking if you don't have an adequate framework in place. I think the emission factors you can adjust, and EPA does have their published emission factors. That's not necessarily what the comment was about. It's really more so relying on, say, EPA verification, whether it's through the Renewable Fuel Standard Program. I assume that's what was referred to. But if administrations change and there's less verification, less support for the Renewable Fuels Standard Program, if it's less stringent in terms of CI, I think it's really important that the state has its own sort of framework to look at and own carbon intensity standards to, work towards, because we do know that biofuels in particular, depending on where they're sourced, they can be dirtier than, or, same as what we're currently burning. And I think it would be a shame if we procure that and pay more for something that's not actually cleaner.
I believe that was pretty well said. I just want to follow up by saying that we know it will be a lot more work to kind of build a bigger portfolio of indicators. But again, having, something that does provide a broader protection, as long as they're credible inputs, would be worthwhile. So essentially that framework that Monique talks about, something that needs to be perhaps broader, but clearly developed and adopted as a true framework, so that it doesn't become subjective or not subject to change, but it needs to be broader than what it currently is, we think.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Tae-sun. Next, we have a question from Commissioner Kauai, and then I'll get to you, Max.
Mark, quick question. You mentioned during your discussion or presentation that you were proposing that the developers do an earlier GHG analysis. How early in the process were you thinking?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. We think that, again, that this ought to be, and again, we've discussed this internally briefly, but when a project is submitted, you ought to have a pretty clear idea of what the greenhouse gas impacts are. So it needs to be at the early stage. I mean, would it be at the point that it's actually submitted that there's a real clear it would be ideal if every developer had this framework and was able to exercise it themselves, and then we had an idea and then we could cross-check that quickly. Monique, from a process standpoint, do you have a clear kind of methodology in mind?
So you're proposing that the developer, when they are submitting their bid to Hawaiian Electric, that it includes a GHG analysis. Is that my understanding?
Well, they really should have an understanding. I mean, we think that's an important component of the bidding process. You need to understand what we certainly know that the commission is required to evaluate that, but we think developers ought to, take the responsibility to assess that as well.
Okay. Clarice?
Was there any clarifying comments you want to make
Well,
on that?
I guess my question is that if I'm a developer and I have the uncertainty of whether or not my project is going to get approved, and GHG analysis are very expensive to do, would that discourage me from bidding into Hawaiian, even participating in the process? But I could see both sides of the coin.
Yeah, I'm not going to, use any particular example, but you can imagine if there's a large capital project and, a developer isn't aware of what its greenhouse gas impacts are, and it proceeds and it gets rejected because it didn't take that into consideration. It does need to have an understanding, some basic understanding of kind of where it fits in an acceptable framework, evaluation framework. And, maybe one of the things that we do moving forward is we work with developers on the front end. Once a framework has been established on how to employ that, we had to do that when we were developing projects for the hydrogen hub, for example, where we, had to assess a variety of different impacts, including carbon. And, that was challenging, but I think once we build a framework, it will make it easier on developers. And as I mentioned, they're going to be devoting a lot of capital in this process, and it is worth it to spend some money on that requirement that, of law that the carbon needs to be, evaluated.
So, but if, let's say not all projects require GHG analysis. So if the developer's position is that a GHG analysis is not required, does it still have to submit that information to Hawaiian Electric? Or
Yeah, I mean,
if
if there's a clear exception, then that would be, an unnecessary thing to do.
Okay, thanks, Mark.
Sure.
Can I add just a few comments to clarify? I think it's important that it's really for the eligible projects, the combustion projects, specifically the fuels, biofuels projects that this would fall under. And then I really see that first initial stage being a higher level screening, where you kind of set, can you meet a CI threshold? And it's not necessarily going to be a full detailed analysis, but it will screen out some of your really dirty, potentially dirty projects.
Thanks, Monique, for the clarification.
See, Clarice has her hand up as well.
Yeah, I promised Max he'd go next, and then I'll go to Clarice.
Oh,
Go ahead, Max.
I also have a question for the Energy Office, since we're on this topic already, on your comments. I was wondering if you could elaborate on this recommendation about increased oversight by the PUC, the CA, the Energy Office in the selection process within the competitive bidding framework. Why does the Energy Office feel that the current oversight mechanism under the IO and the IE isn't working?
It's a good question. So the oversight is really on the onus of, we view that from, the commission's standpoint, not necessarily from the other organizations you mentioned, which, I only bring up to raise that they have limited visibility in the process. But specifically for the commission, they actually ultimately make this decision on these projects. And certainly it makes a lot of sense to have an independent operator, independent engineer, review this process and make sure it's done objectively. But there very well could be, let's say, a variety of criteria that would be either disqualifying or concern based on previous decisions, other issues, that it would be, we think it would be appropriate for the commission to have a early bite at the apple to make comments on that. And the current process doesn't allow for that. So that's really what we're raising.
Do you have a sense, Mark, what those concerns might be?
I mean, I'd rather not come up with some hypotheticals right off the top, but, I certainly can envision what some of those things could be. If they're, again, just based on previous decisions that might not be consistent with the project proceeding, or there may be, for whatever reason, I mean, that it may not be a high probability event, but right now, there's no way for the commission to really have any impact on the process until very late stage.
Got it. Thanks, Mark. Pekka, I was wondering if I could ask you about something you said earlier in the presentation, where when you were discussing the changes regarding the credit rating consideration. You mentioned that there were already some mechanisms in place to address this risk developers are seeing of increased financing costs to their projects. And then you discussed the legislative proposal that you're possibly going to present next session. I was wondering what some of those mechanisms you feel are already in place that are trying to tamp down that risk for developers.
Sure. So I think developers have several different concerns, or more likely their financing parties have several different concerns. And one is the risk of non-payment, right? If we're not a credit, we don't have investment grade credit rating, is there a risk that we won't pay? Is there a potential risk of bankruptcy? And again, we don't have any intention of those things occurring, but we can see why financing parties have those risks. But in Hawaii, we're uniquely situated compared to maybe a utility on the mainland. One, there's no market for energy here. So if we have every incentive to continue to pay developers, because if we don't, we can't go buy from someone else. We have to build a whole new project, which would take 5 to 6 years. And in terms, what would we be doing for generations? So we have every incentive, unlike maybe a utility that could go buy and sell energy on a market somewhere else, to decide whether or not they're going to pay a certain contract or not. Also, Hawaii has 2 regulatory mechanisms for automatic cost recovery for the power purchase payments, which is the power purchase adjustment clause and the energy cost recovery clause. And so, Hawaiian Electric is assured that there's funds coming in from customers, and it's 100% pass through, right? We pay the developers. If we pay the developers a developer $100, we charge our customers $100. We take that $100, we pass it back to the developers, right? So there's those automatic recovery mechanisms that exist. Now we recognize those things exist, but financing parties who aren't familiar with Hawaii, may not feel as comfortable with them. And even though we've been trying to educate and provide materials to educate along this information, what we have heard from developers is they still want more, which is why we've then also come up with the idea for the legislation.
I see. Okay. And then aside from the credit risk, there's been a number of withdrawals in the stage 3 process that are aside from that issue, site control and access to point of interconnection, or long lead times for acquiring parts and, generators, whatnot. I'm wondering what other learnings from stage 3 HECO are integrating into this now RFP process that maybe aren't in the comments or aren't discussed so far that you're thinking about, if any?
I think the other reasons we've seen projects drop out of stage 3 have been common among all the stages. And I think if you look at procurements in the mainland, but if you do look at procurements in the mainland, or you just look at news articles, it's very common that you select a set number of projects and then not all of them make it to the finish line. We do have requirements in the RFP focused on site control, but those are focused largely on where the facility is and not requiring site control upfront for easements needed to reach interconnection points. So that might be an area that we look at, but it's very hard to expect developers have a fully developed project, every T crossed and I dotted at the time of proposal, and the money that we needed to do that without. We also don't want to discourage bids into the RFP. We don't want to make the RFP process so cumbersome and so expensive that developers just say, hey, Hawaii's already expensive, Hawaii's already hard to develop at, and now it's like even harder. We don't want to do that. So we have to sort of balance those risks. And I think, just being able to move the projects faster, having the rolling RFP concept will help with the procurement issue, because right now, it takes so long to get between procurements that we're having to ask for very short GCODs. So being able to move the process faster, procure generation in advance, having longer lead times for the projects to be built will help, I think, on the procurement. And that was one of the concepts behind trying to do the rolling procurements. Also, it allows the developers to know in advance, hey, there's going to be a procurement coming up. If we miss this one, we know the next one's, approximately 14 months behind. So we can focus our efforts and be prepared for that one. Whereas in the past, if developers aren't aware of when the next procurement is, they're not sure when to start the development, when to start looking at procurement and timelines. And so hopefully having a more regular cadence of RFPs would also help with some of those issues we've seen in the past. But I don't think you'll ever eliminate them. I think some of them are just inherent in a development process, whether that's in Hawaii or elsewhere.
Great. Thanks, Becca. Appreciate it.
All right, next we have a question from Commissioner Yost, and then I'll go to Clarice.
This is mostly for Becca, I think. I just wanted to know, where are you in your consideration of the concept of renewable energy zones at this point? I mean, the theory behind those was to create some greater certainty as to which sites would be most, suitable for interconnection at the least cost, and also, with ideally community acceptance somewhat built in.
Sure, I can start and then maybe Colton or Ken feel free to jump in. But in the IGP RFP, we propose an additional points adder if developers propose a project within one of the renewable energy zones that we have identified. And those are cited in the IGP RFP. And those were identified through the integrated grid planning process. And so right now we were encouraging development into those areas through that sort of additional points adder. And then I'll turn it over to Colton if he wants to add, or Ken if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I'll go in and Ken jump in as well. So Commissioner, part of the reason we're doing that is we want to have a better understanding of interest by the development community or developer community on where they have a desire to site projects, and that will help guide us on then implementing some of the renewable energy zone early stage efforts that we had talked about in our integrated grid plan, including identifying what the infrastructure is needed to support the energy potential in the area, not just for one individual project, and then begin those early stages around developing estimates and schedules and engagements with the affected communities on the creation of that zone. And then as we do our long-term IGP RFP, and as we do subsequent RFPs in the future, the renewable energy zones that are identified and sort of flagged as ones where there's sufficient interest to move forward, at least in the initial stages in developing a res, that can then be an opportunity for future projects that get bid in to become part of that renewable energy zone and may modify it a bit too.
Yeah, and sorry, this is Ken, and sorry, my camera is not working. But just to add, so as Colton said, we are going to incorporate the res concept into the long-term RFP. Prior to that, we are planning to issue another RFI to see where areas of most interest are for development. And that's largely due to, we did an RFI over a year ago now. We didn't receive much information through that. And some of that was also bid in through the stage 3 RFP. So the combination, so I guess we want to refresh that where development is possible, and then use that as a way to start recommending areas for transmission development to support res.
All right, thanks for that update. As a follow-up to that, has HECO given further or more consideration than in the past to potentially securing sites itself ahead of time and seeking developer input on developing projects on those sites, whether HECO procured the property through lease or purchase? That's something that's happened on Kauai.
So I think we have done that. So in past procurements, the most recent one, we offered a Waiana site, and stage 2, we offered various sites for battery storage projects because the land we owned was relatively small. And I think what we found is there's not a lot of participation with the company-owned sites as much as I think developers prefer. They find what we've heard from feedback is that they prefer finding sites, and that's part of their competitive edge of how can they procure those sites at certain pricing. But we when it is available, we have offered those sites. We also did the procurement on Lanai, where we worked with the majority owner of the land there to secure a site and offer that site. And that was the only site to bid on in that procurement. So I think we've had mixed results. I think as land is available, we would obviously offer it where it makes sense. But the other risk, is it does cost money to procure and obtain those sites. And so that has to be taken into account in feasibility and what we're capable of doing at a given point.
And Commissioner, just to add to what Becca said, in the past RFPs, going all the way back to the stage 1 RFPs, one of the really significant bits of direction we got from the past commission was to not restrict bidders to certain sites, and so let bidders select sites that they believe would be best or most competitive for a project. And in that context, the utility, not an existing site, but identifying and then procuring a site for a project that could be done either by Hawaiian Electric or by an independent power producer, was challenging with that sort of larger framework of guidance. If we're talking about a future state where and a future RFP is more focused, so either to an area like a res or to even a particular parcel, where by having that focus, you can do more work up front. You can build, you can at least plan infrastructure and do early engagement, if not actually build and design and build infrastructure there ahead of an RFP. That's an option, that's a possibility, but I think we have to figure out how to make that work and what other aspects of the competitive bidding framework and at least the practices that have been done in past stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3 RFPs have been open to all locations, maybe shifting it more towards that development here. And we got to think of how all of the elements of the RFP would need to change or be modified if that's the direction we want to go in. But we're definitely open to the idea. We're just very cautious and want to make it work.
Also, I forgot to mention that we did also offer our site on Molokai as well. And then in this IGP RFP, we are offering a site at the Marine Corps Base, Hawaii, where we've worked with the Marine Corps Base to identify a site in advance that it will be offered and open to all bidders. And I saw that was also a comment in the chat about, is there more developer interest where HECO and affiliates are not allowed to bid on the site? We've done it both ways. And the interest is about the same. And I will note that in our last procurement in stage 3, we did offer a company-owned site and we did select an IPP, not a company-owned bid for that company-owned site.
All right, thanks very much.
All right, Clarice, thanks for your patience. You're up.
I have a clarification question for HSEO regarding the emissions discussion. So I think one of the bullet points on your slide said that one of the solutions and suggestions would be to evaluate life cycle emissions as early in the project selection process as possible. But then in the discussion, I think you mentioned that wouldn't necessarily be the case, and that you would recommend like a higher level framework during the RFP process, and then the actual LCA would happen after, I guess, project selection and in the PPA review. So yeah, just seeking clarification on that suggestion.
Yeah, so Mark left, Monique Schaefer with the State Energy Office. So really, I see it you could take it either way. I think really what is important is, recognizing that life cycle analysis can be, if you're doing a really full life cycle analysis, it can be egregious, it can be expensive, and we certainly don't want projects to be precluded from entering, into the RFP because of that. That said, we certainly think it's important that life cycle analysis at some level You know, not the detailed analysis that you would typically do is done, you know, later in the PPA process, but some framework where you are screening early, whether it is, you know, threshold criteria, you know, setting a CI score for example, fuels to meet. I think that could potentially screen out projects that bid in and then go through the full production analysis, go through, you know, the full analysis, and then you have that sort of batch group of projects that makes it difficult once you get there to you know, push back on. So I think, you know, it's twofold. It needs to happen early at a very high level, and then again, you know, the full life cycle analysis for eligible projects later on.
Okay, and then that brings me to my next question, which is about, like, say in like a high level screening, just to start with, where you're, you know, perhaps applying CI or carbon intensity thresholds. I guess how would, say, a developer go about doing this when in the RFP, projects, you know, that involve combustion are only need to provide evidence of a fuel supply for at least the first 3 years of the firm PPA term? I'm curious, like, given that, you know, the terms of these contracts are longer than 3 years, do you have any insights, you know, as to how to consider different types of biofuels, say, that one particular plant would utilize throughout the term of the entire contract, and not necessarily the term of like a fuel contract?
Yeah. So I would say for at least the fuel itself, you look at, you know, what's anticipated to be burned in that first 3 years, and you follow up on life cycle analysis as your fuel contracts are submitted and the associated life cycle assessments are submitted. But there's other components of the life cycle analysis that you know, really can't be ignored. One of them being power plant efficiencies and heat rates. You know, a big driving factor of all of the life cycle analysis that we've done here at the Energy Office actually is that power plant efficiency, and understanding, yes, that fluctuates with time. But, you know, when you do GREET and you do an analysis in GREET, you're applying that efficiency at all points in the life cycle. And this is getting into specifics. But it should be, you know, something that is at least looked at a very high level. I think, too, there's probably certain fuels that we just don't really want to see, palm oil. That certain fuels are going to have very, you know, high life cycle carbon intensities, and it would be a shame if those certain biomasses, you know, those should be screened out early.
Thank you. And then I guess, is the Energy Office anticipating providing like a suggested framework for this? I know you guys are working on a fuels report. Is that going to be part of the fuels report?
So we follow a framework in that fuels report, which we're anticipating. I think our suggestions is really to use GREET as the framework, noting not all of the default emission factors are appropriate, but I would say GREET is the standard harmonization tool that is used across the industry. And I would recommend that as the framework.
Okay, thank you.
All right, last call for questions from the commission, and I'll encourage you, if you've been waiting patiently for your chance, feel free to put your question in the general chat, and I'll ask our presenters if you're able to answer the questions in the chat, either in writing or as you're referencing some of the verbal questions. Please consider doing that. We have limited time, but I want to do our best to make sure everybody has a chance to have their questions answered. But last call from the commission. Any questions before I move on to the consumer advocate?
This is for Hiko. I was just wondering if you could speak more to the thought behind on the additional points, weighting co-creation up to an 80 possible addition and project siting at 40, especially given that the REZ is somewhat of a new concept in scoring. I was wondering if you're anticipating that weighting increasing in the future. Just if you could talk us through the thought behind how you weighted all of those factors.
Sure, I'll start, and then Greg, maybe you can jump in. But I want to know that, especially for the community co-creation, I think that was something that came out of, or not think, that was something that came out of the energy equity docket as something communities wanted to see. And so we found this as a way to pilot the concept of the community co-creation in this first round of IGP RFP, and that'll allow us to get a sense of are developers interested in pursuing that? How has it worked? Was it successful? And then we can go from there if we decide either it gets higher points and we keep it as a additional points criteria, if it's something that becomes more integral into the RFP process. So this is really sort of a pilot for that particular mechanism. And I do foresee that changes could occur with the scoring of that, or even how it's incorporated into the process. And then with regards to the land and co-creation, and it's not just, for the land, it's not just related to res, we're also looking to, use sites that might be brownfield sites, or that are avoiding sort of prime agriculture and incentivizing the use of sites that have already been zoned for industrial use. So again, I think that can change. And as I noted, everything is we try to improve on every process. And so obviously we'll take the feedback and we'll take the lessons learned from IGP RFP and how that works, and we'll decide if those weightings were appropriate or not appropriate. We did want to make sure that the weightings gave enough weight to incentivize developers to either participate in co-creation or to really think about where they're siting their project, but also not overwhelm the scoring and take up, throw out the rest of the non-price or the price too. So it's sort of a balance of what will actually impact scoring, but not overly impact scoring. And then again, it's sort of the trial run this time to see how that works. And then obviously we'll be open to continuous improvement on these issues.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks for those questions from the commission. Next, I'd like to invite questions from the consumer advocate. If any of I see a bunch of you are here, so please raise your hands or come off mute, whatever is convenient for you. All right, Mike, I see you've raised your hand. Go ahead.
Thanks, Mike. And again, a big appreciation to Hawaiian Electric and the Hawaii State Energy Office for providing these perspectives. I think this discussion, just a general comment first, and then two questions to help inform, how we look at these. It's, as we work together to drive further increased efficiencies in this process, we're talking about progress towards our renewable energy goals and doing it equitably, cost effectively, and enhancing reliability and safety on the grid. So that's kind of how the frame, and just to provide some context about the two questions I have for Hawaiian Electric. First, thank you to Commissioner Yost. I had a very similar question about whether Hawaiian Electric would consider something like a land use RFP, because there's always a question of how do we increase community involvement early on in the process, and how do we easily interconnect projects that are of the greatest benefit to the grid at a particular location. And I know, Becky, you had mentioned about developers' concerns over the competitiveness of their bidding Could you elaborate a little bit on that, what they've represented in terms of what their reluctance would be to a Hawaiian Electric site?
Sure. I don't want to speak for them, but I know we have received comments in the past that being able to competitively procure sites that are, prime for interconnection and do that at a lower cost and negotiate that rate, is a large part of the cost of the project. And so it goes into the competitiveness of the cost and how they're able to compete with others. But I also wanted to note that we do still do a land RFI. So it's not a RFP, but it is a request for information. And we do invite quite regularly landowners in Hawaii to submit information to us if they are open to using their sites for procurements. And then we provide that information to interested developers via NDA. So we take the information from the landowners and we consolidate that into a list and, location, size, different information about the sites. And we do provide that to landowners. So we do try to bridge that gap. To developers, we try to bridge that gap between the landowners and the developers, so that at least the developers are aware of sites, and we can provide some information related to those sites as part of that process.
And I guess as a follow-up to that, would there be an openness to incorporating sort of a site favorability into the analysis of the RFPs?
I think that's what we're trying to do with the new criteria. That's the add on the additional points of, is it located within res? Is it on, is looking at the impervious cover, previous uses of the land. So we are trying to incorporate and I said, guide developers to choose sites in certain areas.
And then just the general comment on that, I think, it may provide an opportunity if the sites there's more certainty in the process going forward. It may provide an opportunity for the community to be more involved with bidders. And I'm just thinking out loud on who is actually bidding in on certain sites and evaluate as part of the evaluation of those bidders. Food for thought. Second question, I guess, pertains to, could elaborate some on how for like a company-owned site or a company-owned project that may have liquid renewable fuels or biomass, I guess, how does that factor into the competitive process in terms of pricing? And are there estimates of the costs related to that fuel? And I know that, I believe if there was, I would assume there would be a fuel supply contract with that. I'm just trying to understand how that works with the liquid, if there's to be liquid fuels, and how that factors into the RFP process, evaluation process. And given that if there's going to be a fuel supply contract, I would imagine the pricing is going to be uncertain until that's negotiated. But
yeah, so we do factor in fuel costs, whether it's a company-owned project or a developer-owned project that's using a fuel, whatever that fuel may be. That does get factored into the detailed evaluation in the modeling, and that's one of the factors that we use. And I think I can invite anyone from our team that does a detailed evaluation to chime in, but we use a forecast of fuel cost price to determine, out into the future what that fuel cost impact will be when we're inputting that into the model.
Is there, I guess, the actual price would be determined on whatever the fuel supply contract that either the IPP could secure or Hawaiian Electric could secure. It was like a biofuel, is that?
That's correct. And then
okay.
That would be approved by the commission, that contract.
Okay. The reason I'm bringing it up is I'm just trying to assess risk, right? If there's if the fuel supply contract comes out different than what went into the model, there's a difference in the cost benefit.
I mean, that's always a risk with variable costs, such as fuel. But the way, and the fuel are designed as a pass through to customers. But again, we try to forecast that as best as we can using
as accurately as possible.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm sure some folks from our side have some additional questions. Thank you.
Yeah, Mickey, I see you've got your hand raised, so you're next.
Thanks. I'll start with HECO, just to follow up. So Becca, you mentioned that HECO was open to some of the proposed amendments to the RFP, but HECO doesn't think that they are appropriate at this time. Can you go back to that and explain, is there a time or some events that that HECO thinks might make them appropriate? What are those, or what sort of process would make further amendments that HECO has itself said might be appropriate, but appropriate later?
Sure, and I think that the timing is largely related to the company-owned interconnection facilities costs. And I think, we proposed a number of changes which we believe will make large differences and impacts into the development of those costs and how and insight into those costs. And we think that that is a good first step to see how those changes, including the pre-bid developer meetings, providing more standardization in the interconnection equipment and other changes that we're making to that process, and see how that works, see if that does improve the process. And then if, we think further improvement is still needed, then we can consider some of these larger proposal changes in future rounds.
Okay, I see. My next question is for HSCO. Not sure, Monique, did you say that Mark dropped off? If you did, can I ask it of you?
Yeah.
The idea of a shorter cadence for RFP rounds, or even going to something like a rolling procurement.
Yeah, me too.
Do you have examples of that from other jurisdictions, or even other somewhat related contexts? And I know that sounds weird. I was thinking about how in some past conversations we all looked at like FCC spectrum auctions, and those are for telecom. We're looking for electric utilities, but do you have some other examples of shorter cadence, or especially of rolling procurement? And I'd be very curious to look at those other examples, especially to see if there were still effective competitive price pressures.
So I don't personally off the top of my hand, but I can definitely touch base with Mark and Stephen, really stress this, and then try to get that in our comments that we submit as well to the docket.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd be really interested if you guys know of any or could find any.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll make sure that gets relayed back to Mark and Stephen.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Other questions from the consumer advocate? I don't see any hands raised, but one last chance. All right. Oh, yes, Mickey, you're back. Go ahead.
I could follow up with just one small clarification from HECO, just about Mike Angelo's line of questioning about if you've got a fuel project, and I guess it would possibly be a little bit different if it's a self-build versus an IPP with some renewable fuels. Especially with IPPs, are they locked into their PPA price, and is it a flat price and they eat the risk of increased fuel cost? Or are those PPAs imagined to be or planned to be structured with a some sort of fuel cost pass through, similar to how HECO has fuel cost pass through?
It would be a fuel cost pass through for liquid fuels, just like our existing IPPs today have, pass-through mechanism. So there are provisions for that in the PPA contract.
Okay, so the initial estimate would just be for the bidding phase comparisons, but then after, what happens happens. Is that fairly accurate?
Yeah, I mean, there's formulas for that calculation, and then it is passed through, and the commission would need to approve and consent to the fuel contracts similar to the PPA contracts.
Yeah, but Mickey, the forecasts that align with the fuel that's being proposed by the bidder is the fuel price at that point that we have to perform the evaluations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mickey. So next, I will invite folks from the State Energy Office. If you have any questions for Hawaiian Electric, now please raise your hands. I am not seeing any hands raised, which is fine. So next, we'll go to questions from anyone else in the audience, and I think maybe the fairest way to do this is start in order of folks who have. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry, I was too soon. I see Eric from the Energy Office, and then Todd. So Eric, I'll start with you.
Hi, this is Eric from the State Energy Office. I have a question about with the potential delay of the IGP RFP. I know that there were a lot of changes made to the community benefits sections of RFP Stage 3. With this delay, do you see more of an opportunity to integrate lessons from the community benefits portions of Stage 3 into the RFP IGP? And if so, how do you plan to identify those lessons and to integrate them?
So we're not talking about a significant delay. We're still hoping to issue the RFP in February. And the Stage 3 community benefits packages don't have to be finalized until much later in the process. So we're still very early in the Stage 3 process, and I think it would be too early to incorporate significant changes. There's not been a lot of lessons learned yet at this point, but I think in future, if the need arises, if we do think there's significant lessons learned in future rolling tranches, we could go to the commission and ask for updates at that time.
Thank you.
And next I see Todd, you have your hand raised.
Sorry, I'm not from the HESO, so
okay.
I will ask my question later. Thank you.
Okay, we'll pause. No worries. I think the next way to go is let's direct our attention to the questions already in the chat that haven't yet been answered. So maybe in order, I see Kylie is first. And what I'll do is if you don't think your question's been fully answered, just don't raise your hand. But if you'd like to follow up, please do. So first is Kylie's. Then I see Dan Giovanni's is next, followed by David Berryhill, and then a couple from JS. So if those are still live questions, please raise your hand using the raise your hand feature in the bottom bar there. And if they are not, then I will open the floor to anyone else to raise your hand. Okay, I see David and Dan have raised their hands. I haven't seen Kylie, so we'll start with, let's see who is first in the chat. Looks like Dan. Dan Giovanni, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the presentations today. Question for Hiko regards the for firm generation projects that are bid. Will the price evaluation be based on levelized capital cost or levelized energy cost? And if it's the latter, will the RFP explicitly specify the capacity factors to be used in the analysis? And similarly, would the capacity factors be specified for carbon intensity analysis? Thank you.
Hey, Dan, this is Colton. Good to see you. It's been a while.
Good to see you.
I'll start off the response, at least on the evaluation piece. So when we evaluate bids, they come in layers or levels. So in the initial evaluation, because we're looking at evaluating and considering every single proposal that has come in that initial evaluation, we do it on a much more simplified basis. So that is just on dollars per megawatt basis. So it's basically the fixed, or call it capacity costs associated with the proposal. However, when we're doing the detailed evaluation, when we're focusing on a smaller set of candidate bids or projects to award to in that detailed evaluation, we consider both the fixed and variable costs associated with the project, including the forecast for the fuel that the project will be using. So that's how we do the evaluation. In terms of the RFP and any guidance on capacity factors, I believe in stage 3, we provided capacity factors subject to check from the team, but I'll defer to the RFP team and the planners on what we have in the draft RFP for IGP.
Thank you, Colton.
Next up is David Berryhill. Please come on off mute, turn on your camera, and if you don't mind, just again introducing yourself and if you represent somebody.
Sure. Hi. My name is David Berryhill. I'm with Hawaiian Electric Power. We intend to participate in this RFP, and so we have some questions related to interconnection. So, for of the pre-screened interconnection locations identified in this RFP, for the locations where there's an available bay and injection capacity in excess of what may be being sought in this RFP, if the project has the ability to inject more than what's being sought in this RFP, which would optimize the use of that available bay, just given the extent and regulatory effort attended with expanding a substation in the future. Can you discuss how Hawaiian Electric would evaluate projects that only utilize a portion of the injection capacity at that bay versus projects that will seek to maximize that injection capacity up to the single point of failure? Thank you.
Yeah. Good morning, David. It's been quite a while since we last spoken as well.
Yes.
So thank you for the question. Yeah. So for everyone, so in a substation, like a transmission substation on any of our islands, the substation is broken up into bays, and each bay is sort of like call it a parking stall in which you connect equipment that ties in David's case, a power plant that wants to connect to the substation in that bay or in that parking stall. And that parking stall or the bay does have a certain amount of capacity that the bay can handle. So effectively, to answer your question about that capacity, a project that connects to the bay, let's say a power plant is located right next to that substation and just has a tie line with breakers and making use of the bay to then connect to the grid. For that example, the project and the facility that's connecting to that bay effectively has the full capacity of that bay. That full capacity of the bay, however, is dependent upon the equipment that's installed in there. So if, like say a bay is rated, can potentially take up to 80 MVA. But if breakers rated for lower kVA rating are installed to save some money, or the line between a power plant and the bay is sized for a lower capacity, then the bay can, although the bay can handle more, the equipment that's installed and connected is going to be the limiting factor. So that needs to be figured out and addressed and determined. But effectively, that bay's full capacity may not be fully utilized, but cannot be utilized by anyone else because you can only fit one car in a parking stall effectively. So that project or the developer or the equipment does effectively take up the full capacity of that bay, even if it may not be using it. However, everything downstream, or I guess upstream of that bay, the bus, the transmission lines, the high voltage lines that sit outside of the bus that the substation is connected to, all of that capacity is not reserved at the maximum level of the bay. It's based upon the capacity of the facility that now is injecting, call it 30 more megawatts or 50 more megawatts of power. And there's no reservation of the capacity of the rest of the equipment. So although the bay may be reserved, effectively, used up by that one generator, the rest of the transmission system, the rest of the substation's capacity is not reserved for that project.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
All right, next I have Todd. And again, please introduce yourself and if you represent anybody. And if you don't have a question, feel free to lower your hand.
Yeah. Todd Kanja with Kanja Consulting. I have one question in regards to project type. And good to see you and thank you for having this technical conference and hello to a lot of good friends. The RFP indicates that there's 5 project types that are being sought. For the firm renewable dispatchable generation projects, would a firm project that is co-located, meaning it can be dispatched independently with a BESS, connected via single interconnection, would that be considered as a qualifying project type, or are they excluded for a particular reason?
We're actually working on clarifying this language, Todd, right now in the draft. So I think we'll provide some clarity, and I think we're still sort of going through that consideration. So we have had projects like this in the past, but we are, like I said, looking at whether we need to provide further clarity, and in the next draft we'll provide that. And we are intending to have a technical conference after we receive further commission feedback, just to go over any changes to the draft based on the commission feedback, so we can make sure to cover this then.
Hey, Todd.
Okay. Sounds like it's. Hey, Colton.
Hey, Todd. Hey, if I can, and I'm sorry for maybe speaking out of turn, but in your question, I just want to make sure we're understanding the intent or the desired mode of operation. So you would have, say, a combustion turbine and a battery located on the same project site. They share an interconnection and they share one PPA, but that the combination of the battery and the combustion turbine could operate in a way where you run the battery first for 15 minutes, gives the CT time to start up, and then the CT and the battery, or the CT takes over for the battery at some point. But they operate potentially independently in coordination, but sharing one interconnection facility, sharing one PPA.
Yes, that's exactly correct. Yeah, Colton, you got it exactly right.
Okay. Let us take it back and make sure we can think through how that would work and get some clarification in the language.
Essentially, it would be like a standalone battery energy storage project and a firm renewable dispatchable project, but it's on a single interconnection. So cost efficiency, I think it makes sense, but it wasn't specifically stated. So just wanted to clarify that with you folks.
Okay. Thanks for making that super clear, Todd. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, next I see we have David again. You have your hand up. So, and if anyone else has questions, please raise your hand using the raise your hand feature.
Colton, I wanted to just get an understanding. If a substation's capacity has the ability to take an amount in excess of what you're seeking here, and certainly below the single point of failure, would Hawaiian Electric characterize that as a conforming, acceptable project, in compliance with this RFP? And would you consider it? I mean, would you consider more than what you're seeking?
Okay, this is Ken Aramaki from Hawaiian Electric. Can I get a clarifying question? Are you asking if what is being proposed is above the injection capacity that's there, or you're asking if it's above the entire RFP target?
The injection capacity is 142 megawatts at this particular substation. So I'm looking to see if an amount in excess of the 80 megawatts or 81 megawatts you saw in this RFP would be acceptable, but less than a single point of failure. Assuming the facility, the substation would be capable of handling, that amount of input.
David, if I understand you correctly, the question is, if a substation can take 142 megawatts, the RFP is seeking 80, can someone propose call it 100 megawatt project, interconnected at the substation, which is below the ejection limit of the sub, but is of a capacity greater than what we're seeking in the RFP? Is that
Yes.
an example of the question you're asking?
It is, yes.
Rebecca and Greg, have we thought about that situation? I don't know if we have, specifically in the language we have.
Well, I think it would come down to the evaluation, whether we needed those additional, or how that larger project, if we only need 80 megawatts, we're always allowed to take more energy under the RFP if it makes sense based on the evaluation, right? But whether or not that would come out in the models as something that made sense from a selection process would, I guess, compared to what other projects are being bid, if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Okay.
So projects aren't limited to, I guess, bid to the exact size that we're asking for, but we may not need that additional generation, so the expense from that may or may not be.
Very well, thank you.
All right, next up I see Michelle Sims. If you would please come off, turn on your video, come off mute, and ask your question.
Hey everybody. There we go. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect.
Loud and clear.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for hosting this technical conference. Really appreciate getting to be a part of it and ask our questions. So I am on today from Pivot Energy. We are interested in submitting a proposal and had just a couple questions more so around the sizing of the proposed project. So the first question I had was for a paired project with PV and then a battery storage component, if the PV was, or I guess what I'm thinking is, can the total combined nameplate of the two, does that just have to be above 5 megawatts to qualify, or would they each have to be at least a 5 megawatt nameplate for a paired system?
The generating unit has to be 5 megawatts, and then the BESS has to match the size of the generating facility at 4 hours.
Okay, perfect. So the solar asset or the generating would specifically have to be 5, and then BESS would match that.
Correct.
All right, thank you. And then one follow-up question I had. So in Exhibit N, it discusses the community donation of $3,000 per megawatt per year. I just wanted to confirm for a battery storage, proposal, would that be tied to the rating of the BESS or the power capacity? Or is there any sort of consideration of 3,000 per megawatt hour? Hoping to confirm what the metric you're using there for BESS would be.
I believe
Michelle,
it's
would that
3,000 per megawatt. If you're talking about standalone storage,
Yeah, that's correct.
yeah, it's 3,000 per megawatt.
So like, for example, if it was a 5 megawatt power capacity battery system, but was like 20 megawatt hours dispatched, it would be the 3,000 per 5 megawatts, just to make sure I'm doing that math correctly.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we might have time for one final question. If there's anyone in the chat, please raise your hand. And if not, I can go to one of the questions that was popular in the chat from both Kylie and then from Kika. Have you had a chance to address this? If there's more interest when HECO is and its affiliates are not allowed to bid on the site, is there more interest from other developers?
Sure. As I noted earlier, we have had one procurement where Hawaiian Electric was limited and the interest from others was similar. There's not really a large difference. And then I would note that even if Hawaiian Electric can bid, that doesn't mean they will be selected as an example of our stage 3 procurement where we did select an independent power producer for a company-owned site.
And just to add to what Becca said, right? Non-utility bidders won't know if the utility is bidding on a company site or using a company site for a bid that they might submit. I'm not sure if Kylie's question is around when we offer a facility that already has facilities on it, including power plants, because we've done both in the past.
All right, thank you. And Todd, I just want to confirm your hand is up, but do you have another question or is your hand just up? No, great. Okay, I think with that, it's probably a good time to wind this meeting down. So for next steps, as Becca alluded to, there's some information request answers that should be coming in later this week, I believe, and the commission is going to review those and I think determine what to do next based on what we see. But there is a possibility potentially for another meeting of this sort or other chances to ask questions potentially. And wait, now Mickey, I see your hand is up. Oh, and Mike both. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Mike, before we wind down, and then Mickey.
I was just gonna put a plug in
Mike.
and say that sorry, Mickey, we're in favor of formal procedural step to to opine once we receive additional information. I think, Mickey, that's probably what you.
Yeah, that was what I was that's what I was gonna ask about, and I guess the little sub point is if the commission is inclined to set that up and to let us do that. Just wondering if it's gonna put out any sort of structure like a statement of issues about what it would like to be opined on.
We will certainly consider that. Yeah, all of you, please keep your eyes peeled on the docket, and that is how we will communicate any of that. So, David, I see you've got your hand raised. So maybe this will be the last question before we wind down, or if you had a comment about procedure.
I do. I just want to confirm that in the previous example regarding community benefits for a 5 megawatt PV facility with paired with a 5 megawatt 4-hour BESS, that the $2,000 applies to both both the firm and the PV and the energy storage component for a total of 10 megawatts times $3,000. Is that the way that you're calculating or treating the energy storage component as, is it multiplied by the $3,000 as well as the generation?
It wouldn't, David. It would just be based upon the 5 megawatts of the facility, not the 5 each of the PV and the battery. For a paired system, they go together, but the facility is a 5 megawatt PV and battery system. So it would be the 5 times the $3,000.
What about in a co-located scenario?
Co-located with two separate projects with 2 separate interconnections. But what do you mean by co-located?
Firm generation with co-located energy storage, utilizing single point of interconnection.
I think we'll have to come back and provide a suggestion on that because.
That goes back to Todd's question, or related to Todd's question. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think if it's 2 separate PPAs, 2 separate points of interconnection, even if they're on the same site, then that's 2 projects, and that my inclination be it's.
Gotcha. Thank you for letting me ask that question. Appreciate the time.
You're welcome, and thank you all for your active participation and for, I hope, a very useful discussion for everybody. Please keep your eyes out at this docket, and you'll hear from the Commission as soon as we're able on any next steps. So with that, I think we will close the meeting, and it has been recorded. That will be posted as soon as we can. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.